Welcome to the Exponential Australia Church Leaders Podcast.
Well, hello there, Exponential Australia. It is a great joy to have you with us today as you join us on our Exponential Australia Church Leaders Podcast, as we've been hearing from a wide range of Aussie and global leaders around multiplication and the work of God, particularly in our nation in 2022 and beyond. And today, I'm so excited to be joined by Michael Hand. Michael, along with his wonderful wife, lead Newlife on the Gold Coast and has just taken over Newlife just over, is it 18 months ago, Mike?
Yeah, that'd be right. About November 1, 2020. So November
Amazing.
1, 2020 was my first day.
But prior to that was working on team with Stu Cameron and had planted Newlife Brisbane, which I'm particularly excited to hear about today. But Mike, we're so glad that you would join us today on the podcast.
Yeah, stoked to be here, mate. I've been blessed by Exponential, the form of this ministry over in the United States. I'm really excited. There's now an Australian chapter led by Australian leaders seeking for God to do something unique here. So it's exciting days. So
good. Well, Mike, for those who don't know a bit of your journey, your story, the context of Newlife, I wonder if you just give us a bit of a sketch of your life and your ministry and how you have been led to where you are today.
Yeah, no, great. I was raised in a family that was brought up in the church. So I'm one of those kids. I was a pastor's kid. So I spent my Sundays running around people's feet and stealing stale biggies wherever I could. And about when I was about age 15 or 16, I read a book that really began to talk about the purpose of the church, about it being this beautiful light and hope to the world. And the church I was in was quite not that. And something seized my heart as a 15-year-old. I was like, man, what would it look like for the bride of Christ to be beautiful? And ever since then, my life's been on a trajectory. I kind of ran from my call for ministry for a little bit. I became a teacher. I actually really loved teaching. I majored in history and studies of religion, taught for 2 years. But then God called me out of that, where my mentor, my former boss, Stu Cameron, asked me to come be the youth pastor at Newlife. I said no many times over the period of 2 years. And just through the work of, people with the gift of prophecy, some faithful people I've never met before coming up saying you're running for ministry, God's calling you to run to it. I stepped into ministry, and that was a pretty scary period of time for me. And I often tell people that when I became youth pastor at Newlife, it was the last time I accepted a job at Newlife until my current one. I went from being youth pastor from a bunch of different stuff, became children's pastor and youth pastor to generations pastor, then young adults pastor. And then Stu Cameron, our lead minister at the time, went away on long service leave during the plebiscite. Don't know if you remember the plebiscite in Australia. And he asked me to lead the church in his stead as like a 27-year-old. I didn't know what the heck I was doing. We preached through the story of Daniel about how to live in Babylon in a time of cultural upheaval. And then he came back and I was made officially associate pastor here at Newlife. And then I did that role for like maybe 6 months. And then they turned to me like, hey, we actually think you're called to church plant. And I think God was just really clear to me that in that season, the thing I was called to do was to trust God, but also to really, I've been trusted to follow Stu and to be an armor bearer for Stu in that season. And so my answer was yes. Sarah and I, we had to discern it together. And so we went to church plant in Brisbane. But it was really hard for us because ever since youth pastor was 4 years. Then after that, I've only ever had a job for 2 years at a time at Newlife. So, I was children's pastor 2 years, young adults pastor 2 years, associate pastor for about a year and a half, and then church planter as well. And so it just felt like God kept moving me around a little bit, and I was a bit angry at him because of that. But then when I moved to Brisbane, I think the thing that really grabbed my heart is I'd read a lot of Timothy Keller's Centre Church, talked about urban ministry and urban areas being the way you reach the world. And in Brisbane, particularly the centre of Brisbane's the capital of one of the biggest states in Australia called Queensland. And just this sense of young adults, they're professionals, they were disenfranchised, the poor, they were the creatives, right in the heart of Brisbane City. And I saw this opportunity and something grabbed me. And I'm like, man, God wants to do something here. But the problem was my wife hated Brisbane City. And so I really needed God to bring her along with me. So when I went to check out Brisbane with Stu as a church plant, I got a text on our way home from Sarah. And she said, hey, honey, God's just shifted my heart. I think we've got to really seriously consider this. And God had shifted my heart that same day as well. And so we went off to plant a church in Brisbane. Now, 2 years later, Stu not retired, he resigned from the role, went now down to Wesley Mission, Sydney. And I'm now been asked by the church to step into the role of lead minister of the Newlife family of churches. We don't have campuses, we have churches, so they're locally governed by elders. We have a council that oversees them all. And we're looking to plant more churches as well. So it was a grief for me to leave the church that I planted, but also the right thing at the time. So, yeah. So
good, Mike. There's two places where my mind goes as you share, just briefly some of that story, of which I'd love to dig into today. But firstly, would you just kind of share what it has meant to you to be in what seems to be such a healthy transition process from, someone who has been on team, been with, part of this flourishing church, and what it's meant to really being given the opportunity to step into your leadership under the likes of Stu, and how Newlife has been able to really steward that and foster that and set up what for me seems like one of the really healthy examples of church transition in Australia.
Yeah, it's interesting. I was watching Rick Warren's video the other day. For those who don't know, Rick Warren, leader of Saddleback Global, who's just retired. He's appointed this new guy, I think Aaron Wood or Alex Wood. And just watching their transition process, like just to juxtapose, Rick Warren said to his elders, I will choose the next person and you can affirm and then prepare the church for it, which is great. That's the process they decided on. Everyone agreed that's the way they went. That's not how it works in the Uniting Church. For Stu to have a faithful succession process, it began about 5 years ago. We went to North Point Drive Conference together, and he said, hey, listen, we're thinking about this. We'd love you to consider one day, applying for my role. But the big problem in the Uniting Church is Stu can have prepared his next successor, but that it's not his choice. And he doesn't actually get to a point. And so in many ways, he was preparing me for the last 5 years. And Stu and I work really well together, but I didn't want the role. So every year I'd say to Stu, I actually don't want your job. I actually don't want to be your successor. He's like, are you okay to still be my associate? We'll keep training you. And I'm like, yeah, I love the training, but I don't want your role. Wow. So when he left, the process that happens in the Uniting Church is called a JNC. And so the Uniting Church appoints a body of people representing the congregation, the elders, and the presbytery, which governs the region that we're in, to appoint the next lead minister. And then they welcome applications from ordained reverends first, and then pastors. Now, I'm a pastor, I'm not an ordained reverend. Yeah. So I don't know how many applicants there were, but there were a lot from, I think from around Australia and the world. And really, I think the win here is just the hand of God, because I had to submit myself to a process. I wasn't, it doesn't matter if Stu wanted me or not. I actually had to be compared and assessed to be the best person for the role. Now, whether or not I'm the best person for the role, or God's, who God's anointed for this season, what the process of discernment went through was, I may not have the right age, I may not necessarily have the right skill, but there was a sense of call. And I really was thankful for that process, because a lot of what happened in me was, number one, I didn't want to apply. I was really scared I was really angry that I was, God was calling me to apply, because I had a church plant. It's like my baby. I wanted to stay there. And I knew people would see this as a career move, like I'm climbing a ladder. I didn't want to climb a ladder. I wanted to be at the front line of church planting. But then really, once again, through God's just faithful hand, he showed me that's where he was leading me, and where he was leading us as a family. And so when I applied, the best part is God really said it's going to be about 2 C's: either closure around what Stu had been discerning with the elders around my future, or confirmation. And I wanted to apply to get the closure. So whoever was appointed, I wouldn't be like, yeah, but I didn't apply. Or confirmation, hey, there's actually a call here that I need to say yes to, or work out what God's saying around here to it. So it was there was a 5-year process of preparation, but there wasn't this is my chosen that you must select. Stu had no say in the process. And there was, 3-hour interviews, a bunch of other conversations, a really long, about 2 to 3 month process that I went through, next to other people who went through that same process as well. And I think the idea is not that I'm the best person for the role. The discernment was that I was the person called into the role. And so it was a bit different. I was reading Rick Warren's succession plan. I'm like, oh yeah, we don't have that luxury in the United Church. There was this submission to the will of God, and just going, God, this is, I think this is Michael, but it may not be, and you have to control it. So Stu and the elders weren't able to control the succession planning. So really, I'd say it's the faithfulness of God. But despite the lack of control that Stu had, I think what I'd honor Stu in and the elders at the time is to go, we may not be able to control this process, but what we can control is forming Michael, training Michael, and leading Michael. Regardless, that if he's not called to be lead minister of the Newlife family of churches, then wherever he's called to next will be blessed because of what we faithfully did. And that's taught me a lot about what am I doing this season? Who am I raising in this season? Not because I can control who's next, but because in this season, what I'm called to do is raise and develop and train.
That's great, Mike. I wonder, as you kind of share some of your journey and how God's been so faithful in that, and also just obviously very intentional leadership, particularly as we're seeing a lot of leadership transitions happening in our nation at the moment, a lot of millennial leaders stepping into roles of leadership, whether intentionally or involuntarily because of a shifting of the times. I wonder what you would say to kind of, brothers and sisters in ministry who are kind of, sitting there wanting to be faithful and sensing a call to, faithfulness in ministry and the shifts that are happening in our days, whether it be church planting, whether it be within the existing structures of church, to those who might not yet feel ready, because my guess is that you may not have yet felt ready to lead a church like Newlife. Like, what would you say to other people who are sitting in a similar situation?
It's weird. I'm not sensing a lot of people feel called into ministry at the moment. It's probably one of the hardest times in my life to be called into ministry. And I was actually just reflecting on this morning, Charlie. In many ways, the last 2 years has dulled our edge as pastors and as leaders. We've gone into survival. And then we all know those stories about one pastor overseas or in another part of our country who's not surviving, they're thriving, they're initiating, and we feel the weight of, man, I'm not doing that. Like, I don't, my church is shrinking, not doubling. And then you have that one pastor like, oh, my church was fine throughout COVID, so you didn't have enough faith. And you're like, oh, smokes, what the heck is that? And I think for me, my comfort is drawn from a lot of my ministry story comes from a reminder of Isaiah chapter 6. In Isaiah chapter 6, what God says to Isaiah is, he sees the glory and the holiness of God, and his only response to the throne room and the cherubim and the seraphim and their worship, holy, holy is the Lord God Almighty, the God of heaven and earth, is to say, send me and I will go. And what God says to him is this, cool, you're going to go to a people who won't listen. Their hearts will be hard and you'll have a fruitless ministry. And the answer is, if you were called to that, what would be your answer?
Wow.
Now, there were fruit from Isaiah's ministry. Like Hezekiah did have a moment of repentance. And we would be wrong to say completely fruitless. Like, we have one of the greatest salvation stories in his prophetic work in those chapters. Like, it's amazing. And Isaiah was able to see what he did in that time, what he prophesied in that time, how it went on. It's going to go on for millennia. It's phenomenal. But what Isaiah was called to was faithfulness, not success. And the reason why I say that is just in my own story. I stepped into, I feel for this Aaron Wood guy at Saddleback, right? I'm stepping into the shoes of one of the most successful United Church pastors in the last 20 years, Minister Stu Cameron. He tripled the size of our church. He's planted new churches. He's considered an apostolic leader. He's forged. And here I am. And you step into this, and the weight that I feel is, I've got to do the next great thing. And it's just a lie. I've got to do what God's called me to.
Wow.
I've got to be obedient. And when I step into the role of the pressure of the world, and I'm not focusing on godly ambition is God-sized dreams, God-sized obedience, all this stuff, then what I end up doing is I start operating in my flesh. And the thing I say this, and this is my daily struggle. Like this is just helpful to confess. I have a high anxiety disorder, so I struggle with anxiety. And when I don't keep on top of this, my anxiety goes off the Richter scale because I operate in my flesh. Yeah. But when I recognize Jesus builds the church, then here's what I'm doing. All I'm called to do is say yes. Wow. And go, God, am I doing what you've asked me to do? Am I stepping in what you line with what you've asked me to step in line with? So I guess in answer to your call, those who are considering, the question I would ask is, number one, like, are you just saying no because you're scared? And I go, good, be scared, be petrified, because when I'm petrified, I do two things. I go to control, or I go to my knees. One of those is sinful, and one of those is really important. And so even this morning I woke up and I'm thinking about all these things in my mind. I'm like, oh, I've just got to get to my emails. I'm like, no. Pause. Go pray. I wouldn't pray if I wasn't scared. The idea of being, so there's a sense that the second thing I say, if you're discerning a call to ministry, is don't discern it alone. I was talking to one of the guys I'm discipling at the moment. He's like, how do I know I'm called to ministry? And I said, it's not on you to work that out. They're nowhere in the Bible, very rarely. Isaiah, who had a very unique call, but we're not called to be Isaiah. There's almost nowhere in the Bible is someone exists in a vacuum of vocation. We're given community, we're given elderships, we're given people. So I said to him, so you might think you got a call to ministry. Has someone else confirmed that? What are other people saying about it? Who else are you seeing in your life that is spiritual fruit that's able to say this about you? It's not on just you. And that's what community is. So when every step of my role in the ministry, and there's always going to be naysayers. I always remember Tim Keller would say when he went to plant a church in New York, he had a whole bunch of people be like, oh, I don't think you should do that. That's not a good idea. But him and his wife and the leaders at the time, like, there's a call here. Let's step out. But every time, even with my lead minister, I didn't want to do it. I ran it through my supervisors. I ran it through people that mentor me, disciple me, and they all said, you got to test this out. Wow. You got to test this out. So at some point, you got to recognize it shifts from discernment to disobedience. And that's important that you recognize that. But what we need at the moment more than ever, what I need leaders in our church that have an edge. I need leaders that are fresh. So if someone's sitting going, man, I might be called into ministry. Oh, man, we need pastors. We need fresh leaders more than ever right now, because there's a bunch of us that have been on the front line during the pandemic that need people to come through and go, hey, let me show you what it means to dream again, to think again. So if that's someone listening today, I'd just be like, hey, say yes to God. There's nothing greater you could do there.
Wow. I can remember earlier this year, you and I and a bunch of other kind of pastors sat around in a circle, and it caused me to think about that line that you used, obedience rather than success, and you'd kind of shared around a line that you'd heard Mark Sayers say some time ago around what if God was just getting warmed up, what if the opportunity before us may be hard yards, however the outcome is a move of God in our time. And I wonder if you'd kind of share a little bit of your heart there as to, it does feel like we're living in very interesting times. And as you say, we can go to control as the church, or we can go to our knees. Like what is your sense as someone who I feel like has a finger on the pulse around some of these things about what the Lord might be doing very humbly in his church in Australia around the opportunities that are set before us?
Yeah, I'm like you, Charlie. I looked at a whole bunch of other leaders, but just when you were talking then, I just got emotional. And the first thing I'd say is, my first answer to that would be like, well, my first thing is I think God's just still getting warmed up with me. I think I just say that to every leader today. What if God's only getting started with you? I just wonder if we always look outside before we look inward, and we think God's, we got some stuff we're working on, but we're pretty much there. And God's been reminding me, Michael, you have not seen or understood what I have yet to do in your life, shaping you, calling out of you. One thing Mark says, be very clear on, any form of renewal that begins in the Australian church will begin with the leaders. Will begin with me, will begin with us. And so I'm sensing, like never before, a call back, a call to personal renewal, a call to intimacy with God, a call to getting on my knees again, relearning rhythms of prayer and devotion that have gotten lazy and slack in my world. The second thing I'd say is I do sense that Australia is entering into a time where the church is no longer going to be able to be grey. And I think there's a need for boldness and I think humility all at the same time in the Australian church. I think a boldness around what we believe and why we believe it, but then a humility about how we actually interact with our culture. One of the greatest things I think the Australian church has to offer the Australia right now is encounters and experience with the presence of God, not encounters and experience with our politics, our morals, or our ethics. And I've been meditating a lot, particularly I'm reading through the book of Leviticus at the moment with a Bible study. God called me to that at the end of Easter. It's been a joy and a pain all at the same time. But I've been reminded how the mission of God from Genesis 1 all the way through is that we might dwell in his creation with his presence. And everything's been about redeeming that. Even the temple system is about the presence of God and accessing the presence. And I think one of the greatest things I think is God's heart for the Australian church is that we would be places that don't only draw people to the presence of God, but carry the presence of God into our world, into our place. I think there's something there for us around renewing how we see and encounter the presence of God. Maybe we're not called in this season to be the greatest apologists. Maybe we're called to be like the greatest prophets. We're actually called to be people that can declare what God is doing in moments and for people as well. So that's probably what I'm thinking, what I'm considering. So one of my leaders last night, we were talking, and says, he thinks we're going to actually look back at this season in the global church and see it as one of the greatest spiritual awakenings. But we always look at past spiritual awakenings and go, oh, it doesn't seem to look like that. But if you look at past spiritual awakenings, they never look like any other spiritual awakening either. And there's something happening right now. And I wonder where not to call us all Isaiahs, like I said, I wouldn't, but the Isaiahs are who are saying, send me God, and I will go. What does it mean for us to be a people who are dwelling in the presence of God, carrying the presence of God, and inviting other people to encounter the presence of God in powerful ways? So, yeah.
I love that, Mike. And I definitely pray that would be so across the Australian church. I guess my last question or area of focus for us in our conversation today is particularly around Newlife and how Newlife has been able to go on a journey of church planting. Of course, what we've talked about today around the heart of a leader and what the Lord is doing in our nation is all multiplication, is all what the Lord is doing in our nation. But particularly for Newlife around setting off on a journey of planting new churches, not just campuses or locations. Tell us why, tell us how, what has the Lord done in the heart of Stu and yourself to actually go, we want to make this a top order priority, not just in word, but actually in strategy and in practice as well. Like how has that journey eventuated for you guys?
I think it just came from the basic research is that you reach people faster by planting churches. No one will experience. So, Newlife's a couple of thousand people now on the Gold Coast. We're doing really well. There's some good momentum. And, definitely before COVID, there was great momentum. We're regaining a lot of that as well. But when you plant a church, you have an unprecedented ability to reach new people with the gospel and to transform the community around it. But even I'd answer your question by starting at the end about where we are now. At the end of COVID, what's interesting is our smaller church plants have regained momentum, attendance, and discipleship effectiveness and community interaction faster than our bigger ones.
Wow. Because
they're more nimble, they're more agile, and there's an element of like this organic feel to it. And it's worldwide, across the globe.
Yeah.
And so smaller churches are starting to actually, see this new life come back into it faster. And I do wonder if one of the things that God's doing in the Australian church and the global church is planting smaller communities more often rather than trying to get people into one community in one place. You and I talk about Hackney a lot in the UK. This idea of planting a church in the middle of, East London, East London's going to be better because we've got 10 churches in this place. It's it's not calling everyone to Hackney. It's like, let's get everyone out of Hackney and into where God wants to move work. So I think when you're church planting, the greatest question should be is, well, hey, what are we going to be judged as for a church? What are we going to be judged as a church? And J.D. Greer has a great book called Gaining by Losing, where he says churches shouldn't be judged by their seated capacity, but by their sending capacity. And there's two streams to that I think church needs to take, because a lot of times when I say that at church, people are like, oh, so you just want us all to leave? I'm like, no. The answer is, wherever you are as a Christian, you are sent. You're not saved to be seated, you're saved to be sent. Right. And so where are you sent? And the question is, some people are like, well, I don't really feel passionate about the Gold Coast, or God's not really using me. I'm like, okay, is there somewhere you would be passionate? Oh, I always had a dream for Brisbane. Great. So we're going to plant a church in Brisbane, and we want you to go there and be on a mission there. But if people don't go to Brisbane, we say this all the time, when we plant a church out in Newlife on the Gold Coast and people choose not to go be a part of it, we go, cool, you're still going. You're still sent. The answer is not, am I sent? It's where. Yeah. And that's really hard. And as the churches grow, the beauty of church planting is ultimately what you're saying, let's multiply out, because two churches can do twice as much as one church. Now, the model at Newlife is that, 3, 4, 5, 6 churches in relationship have an economic scalability that is greater than just one church. But we're about to celebrate one of our first churches that we planted, graduating in the next couple of months, and they're no longer going to be in Newlife Church, and we're celebrating that because they've reached a state of maturation where they're like, we sense God doing something. We've got our own vision and values we'd love to pursue, and there's no hardship or hurt around that, because that's the win. The win's not empire growth. The win's not more campuses. The win is more churches, whatever that needs to look like at whatever cost. And that's the heart of New Life, is that we want to be a missionally sending church that sees more people more like Jesus, whether they carry a New Life name or they don't carry a New Life name. And sometimes we might see people come be a part of a New Life and carry on because they really sense a strong alignment. But if any of our churches said, turn around and go, hey, listen, maybe we could do this on our own, why would we not celebrate that? And that all comes back to why we began this journey. And it was back in 2008, we really sensed God put on our heart to plant 5 churches before I was even part of the church. Wow. And we decided to pursue that and plant 5 churches by 2020. We got to 4. We got 4 churches by 2020. Now we're looking at some new numbers for the next 5 years, which is probably a bit more bold and audacious. And the reason why we did that was actually, what does it mean for us to take seriously what it means to send our best leaders and to plant our best leaders? And we've learned a lot. We've failed a lot. But what we've also seen is people come to know Jesus who would never have come to know Jesus if we just stayed in one location, who would just stayed in one place. Our other heart is that we want to see God bring renewal to the Uniting Church. I'm not sure how many Uniting Church pastors are going to read this or watch this, but it's not a secret that Uniting Church is the fastest dying denomination in Australia. We're the most liberal and progressive, one of the most liberal and progressive denominations in Australia. And I think those two things are synonymous and they are tied. But instead of being a prophetic voice against our denomination, we're going to be for our denomination, plant more Uniting Churches, which have one of the greatest real estate portfolios across any denomination in Australia, so that Uniting Churches aren't going to be Zumba halls or yoga classes or nightclubs or coffee shops, but we're going to put, empty, we're going to fill empty churches with God's people in city centers. You can't go past any town, city, or gathering of people in Australia where there's not a Uniting Church. It's everywhere. They're everywhere, but they're also empty. Wow. They're radically empty. And so what are we going to do with this? And the answer is, as Australia becomes increasingly post-Christian and secular, I think the church is going to become increasingly Christian and more clear and authentic in the commands and mission of Jesus Christ. I think because we're so similar to culture in recent years, we've watered down who we are. Now I think there's going to be a purity to it that's going to refresh Australia. And I think New Life wants to be a part of that. We want to be a part of the renewal movement in Australia. We don't sense a call to be the renewal movement in Australia. We believe God's doing something in Acts 29, in Churches of Christ, in Baptists, in Pentecostals, and we see it across the church. And we also see it in other parts of the Uniting Church too. But we want to be a part of our brothers and sisters seeing that renewal come and happen. And part of that will be church plant. Part of that will be sending out our best leaders to go and plant New Life churches that one day may become their own church. And we would radically celebrate that and passionately celebrate that. Yeah, because our heart is to see more people more like Jesus, not more people more like New Life. That's actually that would be a curse. You know, we don't get that right. But Jesus, man, that's whatever we need to do to see that happen. That's a good goal to have.
Wow. Mike, I've been so inspired by what you've both shared today, but also who you are and your leadership. And yeah, I would really want to hope and pray that a lot of what you've shared in your journey, and even the journey that Newlife is going on, we at Exponential, we cheer you guys on in that. We want to see many more churches take that bold adventure to be able to go and plant more churches. And you really have deposited something significant in our listeners today. So we really appreciate your time today, Mike.
I appreciate it. I hope it's okay. I was drinking coffee. My coffee mug says, but first coffee. So it's a helpful way to, just as we do this in the early morning hours. So just to get prepared. And I just love to say, I love Exponential. And if people are listening to this video for the first time, Exponential is made and organized so that the local church and church plants would thrive and grow. So I think it's excellent what you guys are doing, Charlie. Behind you 100%.
Thank you, Mike. Bless you, mate.
Thanks for listening. For more great resources, please head to our website at exponential.org.au.